Rugby union in Australia is considered one of the top 4 commercial sports. However, it has not been able to match the dominance of the Australian Football League in terms of national reach, or has it been able to match the fanatical following that the sport enjoys in New Zealand. The sport began in Australia in New South Wales, with Sydney University being the first rugby club in the country. This was followed by the first intercolonial match between Queensland and New South Wales in 1882, which established the sport in these two colonies. Over the next 75 years, New South Wales dominated the sport and were the de facto peak body for the country. It can be argued that this is one of the reasons why even today the sport's participation numbers and following mostly comes from New South Wales, closely followed by Queensland, but it cannot be viewed as a truly national game. The first rugby club formally established in Australia was Sydney University Rugby Football Club in 1865. The founding in 1874 of the Southern Rugby Football Union, which became the New South Wales Rugby Union, was the beginning of the institutionalisation of the game in Australia. The first intercolonial rugby match, played in 1882 in Sydney between New South Wales and Queensland, not only provided an avenue for the promotion of the game in the colony of Queensland, it also offered a focus for rugby football in New South Wales, and may well have offset the further encroachment in New South Wales of sports that would later compete with rugby for players and spectators, such as Australian football and association football. In the 1900s, officials of the New South Wales Rugby Union, supposedly the guardians of the game, assumed the position of owners and controllers, following years of dominance of the game by New South Wales teams, until the formal establishment of the Australian Rugby Football Union in 1949. As a result, the custodians of the game in Australia were for the Australian game's first 75 years New South Welshmen. It can then be claimed that this discouraged the expansion of the game throughout the country up until this time, as New South Wales were in control of the sport at a national level, but their primary focus was the success of their team against others in Australia. The establishment of the ARFU was an outcome of the struggles and rivalries between the New South Wales Rugby Union and all other states' rugby unions, particularly Queensland's. However, much of the momentum came directly from the International Rugby Football Board as global controllers of the game. In 1949, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa became full members of the International Rugby Football Board. This recognition of the Allied ex-colonial territories was expedient and necessary, as collectively they had already become very powerful and internationally successful rugby-playing nations. Despite this, the period from 1950 to 1980 still saw the control based in Sydney. New South Wales were dominating on and off the field as it had during the previous 50 years. The negative effects of this domination and control were demonstrated in 1962 when New South Wales refused to play Queensland on the grounds that the northern state players were just not competitive enough. The previous season, they had lost heavily to New South Wales in Brisbane and in Sydney. Even more embarrassingly, Queensland had been defeated by the rugby union minnow state of Victoria. Even with an increase in loyalty, intensity and parochialism of rugby union in Queensland, its state team could not match the power of New South Wales until the late 1970s. Sydney remained the rugby union capital of Australia. Conversely, in the case of New Zealand, it was the sending and receiving of national teams that provoked the establishment of a truly national governing body, the New Zealand Rugby Football Union, in 1892, 57 years before Australia. Once formed, the New Zealand national body quickly sought to subordinate provincial unions, control local competitions, and punish any infringement of rugby's original amateur principles. This early establishment of a centralised New Zealand organisation in the amateur period, in which tensions between clubs and country were resolved through the control of provincial unions by the New Zealand Rugby Football Union, served two national purposes. One, the development of popular and strong competitions that could produce competitive national teams, and two, protection against professionalism, which at that time was seen as vital to the success of the sport. Gallagher and Steed stated that clubs are not organised promiscuously in New Zealand as they are in Britain. The union decides what clubs there shall be, and supervises their management. In doing so, it particularly desires to ensure the thoroughness and effectiveness of the working of each club, the equality of all of them so far as conditions and opportunities are concerned, the maintenance of strict amateurism throughout, the prevention of one club being completely overshadowed by another by reason of superior financial resources, or by any social or other non-financial inducement that it might offer to players to belong to it, and too easily facilitates for changing clubs. The success of this, at the time in the sport, groundbreaking system of organisational efficiency highlights that centralised power and local subordination characterised the New Zealand rugby governance model, and that the sport benefited greatly from this management system. The New Zealand Rugby Football Union also established the grading of players into first, second and third graded club competitions. They restricted players to only the competition grade to which he was classed. The Provincial Union Committee decided any promotion of players, and a player could not play in the grade from which he was promoted. This ensured that the lower grades were as competitive and scarcely inferior in point of interest to those of the grade above. This again ensured that there was continued competitive competitions at all levels of the sport, which ultimately led to the success and eventual dominance of the sport in New Zealand. In 2011, rugby union is unquestionably a national obsession in New Zealand, which puts it in quite a different situation to that of rugby in Australia. Australian rules football, on the other hand, is widely regarded as a truly national sport in Australia, and is in direct competition with rugby union, particularly as the Australian Football League expands further into the traditional rugby territories of Sydney and Queensland, with the inclusion of the Gold Coast Suns and Greater Western Sydney teams into the national competition. Since the mid-1960s, the AFL has undergone a wholesale process of economic restructuring. This process commenced with the commercial downturn of the former VFL, which ultimately was a catalyst to the formation of the National Competition League in the 1990s. In 1990, the expanded VFL was renamed the Australian Football League, or AFL, and currently spans 5 states, comprising 17 clubs, with an 18th to enter the competition in 2012, which are overseen by a central administrative body. The sport moved to one national body much later than rugby union did. However, strong competitions had already been established in each state, so when a national body was developed, there was still enough strength in the local competitions that there was no individual dominance from one area. In 1982, the league first moved to expand its geographic broadcasting coverage by allowing the South Melbourne Football Club to play games in Sydney. The South Melbourne Football Club was eventually relocated to Sydney, where it became known as the Sydney Swans. This expansion policy was extended in 1987, with the inclusion of the Brisbane Bears from Brisbane and the West Coast Eagles from Perth making up a 14-team league competition. In 1991, the competition was enlarged to 15 teams, with the introduction of the Adelaide Crows. Until 2011, the competition was 16 teams, with the Fremantle Dockers from Western Australia being admitted to the league in 1995, and in 1996, Port Adelaide from South Australia replaced the former Victorian-based Fitzroy Football Club, which merged with the Brisbane Bears to become the Brisbane Lions. The current framework for the league is 9 teams from Melbourne, with Geelong comprising number 10 from the state of Victoria, 2 from both Perth and Adelaide, and as of 2012, 2 each from Queensland and Sydney. This rapid expansion of teams in the national competition has also contributed to the success of the AFL at a national level, particularly in the era of globalisation. Rugby has been expanding as part of the Super Rugby competition. However, it has not expanded at the rate or in the number of locations as the AFL has, which is why it cannot be recognised as a national sport. Regardless of what football code or sport, broadcasting has emerged to be the singularly most important revenue source to most professional sporting leagues and events in Australia and around the world. A major direct revenue source for the ARU comes from the allocation of funds from the television broadcasting rights. The difference between the AFL and the ARU, however, is that the AFL is a national sporting competition who has complete control over the sport and the broadcasting rights. The ARU, however, participate in the Super Rugby competition through SANZAAR, which is South Africa, New Zealand and Australian rugby, and therefore do not have complete control over the broadcasting rights, or even over the competition, as it is an international clubs competition between the 3 countries. SANZAAR control the broadcasting rights, which means that the matches are broadcast on pay TV rather than Freeview in Australia. This limits the game's accessibility, particularly in comparison to the AFL, whose matches are on Freeview every weekend of the season. Rugby union has had a strong history in the states of New South Wales and Queensland. However, from errors made in this history, the sport has not been able to develop into a national pastime. If rugby union is to continue to develop in Australia and be able to appropriately handle threats from other sporting codes, it needs to address the shortfallings of the past.